I've been influenced by a lot of people. I had to think about that a little bit. My parents, of course. My parents worked really hard to put all of their 4 children through school, and I learned the value of education. I got interested in journalism pretty young, and you'll be surprised to hear this, but it was from reading Brenda Starr in the comics. I loved to read, and my mother told me that I started reading the comics when I was very young, before I even went to school. But Brenda Starr was always having a glamorous life and doing all these stories about people who were doing bad things, and I thought that might be an interesting thing to look into. I define community as any group of people that has a common goal. And it's interesting to think about how I got involved with nonprofit organizations, because it happened quite a while ago, actually. I was only involved with one organization while I worked for the newspapers that was not related to journalism, and it was the Rotary Club. When I joined the Rotary Club, it was in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. I was working there. I was the editor of the newspaper, and I was invited to be the first woman member. This was back in 1988, and it had just been required to admit women by a lawsuit. It was quite interesting to see how the men reacted. I did have a little standing in the community because of my job, but they weren't all entirely pleased to have women members. And the first meeting I went to happened to be Secretary's Day, so that everyone thought I was somebody's secretary. You know, there's so many things that Rotary does that help people and make the world a better place, which is incidentally why I got into journalism, because I thought I could help make the world a better place. And I really like to catch people doing something right and look for what's good in the world. And that's why all the organizations that I work with were on my list. I serve on 7 boards of directors for 7 organizations. I generally work with the organizations on communication or marketing, because it relates somewhat to what I've done for a living. But I also like to get involved in other areas, putting on parties or evaluating plans for a new building. Some of the organizations that I work with, like Historic Boulder and the Boulder History Museum, were very involved in the sesquicentennial this year of Boulder, and you know, it was just really neat to go back and look at old pictures and old issues, and how many issues are the same now that they were 100 years ago, or maybe even more than that. So it's just a challenge. I just like to learn new things all the time, and so I'm finding this quite an education to learn how to function as a nonprofit board, particularly in this economy, which has been difficult for all the boards. My core philosophy is hard to pin down, because it has to do with the golden rule and doing unto others. It has to do with trying new things to see what happens. And a lot of that I owe to my late husband, who his kind of rule was, if you don't try it, you'll never know what would have happened. So I like to think of that as kind of a good way to live your life. At one point in my career, I was feeling like, you know, I'm just not thinking the right way, because my thinking seems to always be contrary to what I'm hearing from other people. And I really had a long talk with an editor that I worked for, who was kind of a mentor to me. And he suggested that maybe I should just not try to fit in, that I should realize that my point of view was legitimate, and that as a woman, I might not be speaking up and trusting my gut enough. And so that advice has held up for me for many, many years. And I think a lot of women have that problem, that you feel like you're not part of the network, and you need to be somebody who you're not, and you should be who you are, because who you are is perfectly valid and perfectly legitimate.